In the early 1960s, Detroit was in the middle of an arms race. Horsepower was the weapon, cubic inches were the ammunition, and every American automaker was trying to build the engine that would dominate the streets and the racetrack. It wasn't just about bragging rights anymore. It was about survival. Because in those days, the showroom floor was directly connected to the winner's circle. If your engine won on Sunday, customers showed up on Monday with cash in hand. Ford had already fired some serious shots. The massive 406 FE V8 was tearing up NASCAR. The thunderous 427 was waiting in the wings, ready to rewrite the record books. But hidden between those giants was an engine that most people barely remember today, the Ford 390 FE. And at first glance, it didn't look like a legend. It wasn't the biggest. It wasn't the rarest. It didn't have the insane racing pedigree of the 427 side oiler. Magazine covers didn't celebrate it. Racing teams didn't obsess over it. But what almost nobody realizes is that the 390 FE quietly became one of the most important engines Ford ever built. Because without the 390, the entire FE dynasty might never have survived. And the story behind that engine is far more dramatic than most people think. To understand why the 390 mattered so much, you have to go back to 1958. That was the year Ford introduced a brand new engine family called the FE-Series. FE stood for Ford-Edsel because these engines were designed to power both Ford and Edsel vehicles. At the time, Ford was in trouble. The company had been relying on the old Y-block V8s for too long. Those engines were getting outdated, heavy, inefficient, and competitors were pulling ahead fast. Ford needed a clean sheet design, something modern, something that could grow with the times. The FE architecture was ambitious from the start, a deep skirt cast iron block that wrapped around the crankshaft for extra rigidity, wedge-shaped combustion chambers that improved flame propagation, cross-bolted main bearings on high-performance versions to handle extreme stress. The earliest FE engines included the 332 and the 352 cubic inch V8. They were solid engines, reliable, powerful for their time. But Ford's engineers knew something that most customers didn't. These early engines were just the beginning. The FE platform had been designed with room to grow. And it would need to, because by the early 1960s, Detroit's horsepower war was escalating fast. Chevrolet had unleashed the 409. That engine had become a cultural icon almost overnight. The Beach Boys wrote a song about it. Drag racers worshipped it. Chrysler was developing its monstrous 426 Max Wedge, a purpose-built racing engine that would terrorize drag strips across the country. Pontiac had its high-revving 389 and 421, engines that combined surprising sophistication with raw American muscle. Ford needed something bigger, something stronger, something that could live in both family sedans and race-winning machines. That's where the 390 came in. In 1961, Ford engineers took the existing FE architecture and stretched it. The bore measured 4.05 inches. The stroke came in at 3.78 inches. Multiply that across 8 cylinders, and you got 390 cubic inches of displacement. But the numbers only tell part of the story. What made the 390 special was how versatile it was. In its basic form, the engine ran around 9.5.1 compression and produced roughly 300 horsepower and about 427 pound-feet of torque. That torque figure was huge for the time, and it came in low in the RPM range, which meant the 390 didn't need to scream like a small block. It pulled hard, smooth, effortless. You could merge onto a highway without downshifting. You could pass slower traffic without flooring the accelerator. The power was just there, waiting. Perfect for big American cars. But there was another reason Ford loved this engine. It was incredibly adaptable. The FE block used large cylinder spacing and thick casting walls. That meant engineers could easily adjust bore sizes and compression ratios without redesigning the entire engine. Want more displacement? Bore it out. Want more compression? Machine the heads. Want to add forced induction? The bottom end could handle it. In other words, the 390 was the sweet spot. Big enough to be powerful, small enough to be practical, and that balance would change everything. By 1962, Ford began putting the 390 into nearly everything. Galaxies cruising down Main Street, Thunderbirds parked at country clubs, pickup trucks hauling lumber on job sites, police interceptors chasing down speeders, one engine, 1,000 different jobs. One of the most famous versions was the 390 high-performance engine introduced in the Ford Galaxie. This version ran a higher compression ratio of around 10.51 and used a large Holley 4-barrel carburetor. The intake manifold was redesigned for better airflow. The camshaft was more aggressive. Horsepower jumped to about 375. Torque climbed past 427 pound-feet. Those numbers may not sound outrageous today, but in the early 60s, that kind of torque could launch a full-size sedan down the quarter mile in around 14 seconds, and that mattered, because American drivers wanted big power in big cars. They wanted to feel the road, to hear that rumble, to know they were driving something special. The 390 delivered all of that. But Ford's engineers weren't just thinking about street performance, they were thinking about NASCAR, and that's where the real story begins. At the time, NASCAR was the ultimate proving ground. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. That wasn't just a slogan, it was business strategy. Every major automaker knew that racing victories translated directly into showroom traffic. Ford needed an engine that could survive hours of wide-open throttle on superspeedways like Daytona and Talladega. We're talking about engines running at maximum RPM for 3, 4, sometimes 5 hours straight. No brakes, no mercy. And early FE engines had a problem: oil starvation. At high RPM, oil pressure would drop. The crankshaft bearings would start to overheat. Centrifugal force would throw oil away from the pickup tube. The pump would start sucking air instead of lubricant. And when that happened, engines failed catastrophically. Mechanics described it bluntly. The bearings looked like charcoal. Connecting rods punched through blocks. Crankshafts snapped in half. Entire engines destroyed in seconds. It was a disaster, and Ford was losing races because of it. So Ford's engineers went back to work. They studied the problem from every angle. They ran tests. They analyzed failures. They consulted with racing teams who were seeing these problems firsthand. They refined the oil passages inside the FE block, improved oil pump capacity, strengthened the crankshaft and rods, added better baffling to the oil pan, and the 390 became the test platform for those improvements. You see, the 390 wasn't just a production engine, it was the laboratory that made the FE series stronger. Engineers would develop a modification on the 390, test it extensively, and then apply what they learned to higher performance engines. Every improvement started here, and that work paid off. At the 1963 Daytona 500, Ford-powered cars were suddenly far more reliable than before. Drivers like Fireball Roberts and Fred Lorenzen were pushing their engines hard, lap after lap. Temperatures stayed manageable, oil pressure held steady, bearings survived, and the FE engines were holding together. The entire paddock noticed. But there was still a problem. Chevrolet's 409 was getting faster. A lot faster. And Chrysler's engineers weren't sleeping either. The Max Wedge program was producing terrifying numbers. Ford couldn't afford to stand still. So Ford engineers pushed the 390 even harder. High-performance variants used solid lifter camshafts, larger intake manifolds, and bigger Holley carburetors. Headers replaced restrictive factory exhaust manifolds. Ignition timing was advanced. Fuel mixtures were leaned out for maximum power. Race-prepped versions could exceed 400 horsepower. In NASCAR trim, some teams believed they were closer to 450. And on short tracks, the 390 was genuinely competitive. But there was a catch. At those power levels, the limits of the 390's bore size were becoming clear. With a 4.05-inch bore, airflow through the cylinder heads was starting to choke at very high RPM. The valves couldn't get big enough. The ports couldn't flow enough air. The engine was running out of breath. And that meant Ford needed something bigger, something more extreme. But here's the twist. Without the 390, that next step would have been impossible, because the engineering lessons learned from the 390 directly led to the creation of the legendary 427 FE, the stronger block castings, the improved oiling system, the reinforced crank design, the cross-bolted main bearing caps. All of that was tested and refined on the 390. Ford's engineers didn't have to guess what would work. They already knew. And when the 427 finally arrived in 1963, it inherited those improvements. With a massive 4.23-inch bore and 3.78-inch stroke, the 427 produced 425 horsepower in street trim. In race trim, over 500. Some tunnel port versions approached 600 horsepower in professional hands. That engine would go on to dominate NASCAR and power the Ford GT40 to victory at Le Mans. But its foundation was built on the shoulders of the 390. Every lesson learned, every problem solved, every improvement made, it all started with the 390. And the 390 wasn't done yet. Because while the 427 was winning races, the 390 was winning something just as important. The American market. Throughout the 1960s, the 390 became one of Ford's most widely used big block engines. You could find it in Mustangs growling down Woodward Avenue, in Fairlanes terrorizing local drag strips, in Thunderbirds gliding silently to upscale restaurants, in F-Series trucks hauling thousands of pounds across rugged terrain. It was everywhere, and people loved it. Why? Because it was brutally strong. The FE block's deep skirt design meant the crankshaft was heavily supported. Thick cast iron cylinder walls could handle years of abuse. The rotating assembly was overbuilt by design. Owners regularly pushed these engines past 100,000 miles, an impressive number in the 1960s when most engines were considered worn out by 75,000. And the torque made them perfect for trucks. With over 400 pound-feet available at relatively low RPM, the 390 could tow trailers, haul loads, and climb steep grades without breaking a sweat. Contractors relied on it. Farmers trusted it. Delivery companies counted on it. But the engine wasn't perfect. There was a problem that began to appear as drivers pushed them harder. Heat. The FE engines had relatively tight water jackets around the cylinders. Under heavy loads, temperatures could rise quickly. Towing a boat up a mountain pass on a hot summer day, the temperature gauge would start climbing fast. If cooling systems weren't maintained, overheating could become an issue. And then the real nightmare started. Warped heads, blown head gaskets, cracked blocks. Mechanics saw it all. Customers would bring in their cars, with white smoke pouring from the exhaust, coolant mixing with oil, compression bleeding between cylinders. It was a known weakness, but Ford engineers responded again. Improved radiator capacity, better water pumps with higher flow rates, revised cooling passages in later blocks, thermostats that opened wider and faster. Little by little, the 390 became tougher, more reliable, and by the late 1960s, it had built a reputation as one of Ford's most dependable big blocks, the kind of engine you could beat on for years and it would keep coming back for more. But the world was about to change. By 1970, the muscle car era was reaching its peak. Engines were getting bigger, more powerful, more outrageous. 446 packs, LS6, 454s, Hemi Cudas. The horsepower war had become nuclear, but new forces were closing in. Government regulations, insurance companies, and rising fuel prices. The Clean Air Act of 1970 forced automakers to lower compression ratios dramatically. Engines that once ran 10.51 compression were suddenly dropping to 8.5.1 or less. Lead was being removed from gasoline. Smog equipment was being mandated. Power was being strangled at every turn, horsepower numbers plummeted, and the big FE engines were some of the first casualties. Ford began shifting toward newer engine families like the 385 series big blocks, and later the 351 Cleveland. The 390 slowly faded out of passenger cars. It lingered in trucks a bit longer. Those customers cared more about torque than emissions numbers. But by the mid-1970s, production ended. Millions had been built. But the spotlight had already moved on to flashier engines like the Boss 429 and the Cobra Jet. So the 390 became something strange. Not forgotten, but underestimated. Overlooked by collectors chasing rare muscle cars, ignored by historians focused on racing legends. Yet, if you look closely at Ford's history, its importance becomes obvious. The 390 was the bridge. It connected the early FE engines to the racing monsters that followed. It carried Ford's performance reputation through the early 60s, and it powered everything from luxury Thunderbirds to workhorse pickup trucks. Few engines have done all three. Today, enthusiasts are starting to rediscover it. A well-built 390 FE can easily produce 400 horsepower with modern components. Upgrade the camshaft, improve the heads, and bump compression slightly, and suddenly this ordinary engine becomes a serious performer. Add modern fuel injection, you're approaching 450 horsepower without breaking a sweat. The torque is still there, the strength is still there, and the sound. That deep, rumbling FE exhaust note, it's unmistakable. Once you hear it, you never forget it. So when people talk about Ford's greatest engines, the conversation usually goes straight to the 427, or the 428 Cobra Jet, or the Boss 429. But the truth is, those legends might not exist without the 390, because the 390 FE wasn't just another engine in the horsepower wars. It was the foundation, the proving ground, the workhorse that made everything else possible. It tested the technology. It refined the engineering. It paid the bills while racing programs burned through budgets. And that's why Ford's 390 FE was far more important than most people realize. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Ford's forgotten big block, let me know in the comments what engine you want to see next. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story from the wild history of American horsepower.